Former President Donald Trump taking center stage at a campaign rally in Nevada last night, using the event to talk January 6th, not the attack, but the crowd size.
They never want to show how massive our crowd was. You know the biggest crowd I've ever seen? January 6th. And you never hear that. It was the biggest, and they were there largely to protest a corrupt and rigged and stolen election. It's the biggest crowd, and you never hear that. And you see very few pictures of it, but they're there. That was the biggest crowd I believe I've ever spoken to.
My next guests are out with a detailed account of the Trump presidency, and they make the argument that what happened on January 6th was no anomaly, but rather the culmination of a sustained four-year war on the institutions and traditions of American democracy. The book Divider, Trump and the White House 2017 to 2021 is based on extensive research by veteran journalists Susan Glasser and Peter Baker, including 300 interviews, two of which happened with Donald Trump himself down at Mar-a-Lago. Peter Baker, chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, Susan Glasser, CNN global affairs analyst and staff writer for the New Yorker. They both join me now. It's really a privilege to have both of you with us. Thank you so much. Can I just ask you just very quickly before we jump into the book, you know, to hear Donald Trump out there on the campaign trail, here we are a month, less than a month before the midterms, and he's talking about his crowd size on January 6th in that crass sort of way. I just wonder what your reaction is. Peter, I know you and I covered him so closely for several years. When you see him, do you say, oh, there just goes Trump again, there he is, that's who we covered, he's never going to change? Or do you find something disturbing and somewhat dangerous about this moment right now that we're in?
Yeah, I think he's celebrating, in effect, the January 6th insurrection. He may not say that he approves of the attack on the Capitol, but by celebrating that crowd, that's the message that he's getting across. And the other thing he said last night was he accused Democrats of putting in jail their political opponents. The only political opponents I can see that have been put in jail since Trump left office are the people who attacked the Capitol on January 6th. So if that's who he means, again, he's sort of holding them out as some sort of heroes of his movement and cause, which I think you're right. It really raises questions about the dangerous level of this rhetoric. It's congratulating people for trying to take it into their hands, taking violence as a means to try to disrupt the transfer of power.
And Susan, from a historical standpoint, I mean, we just look at, you know, the last century or so of world history. I mean, there are parallels. I mean, it seems like history is talking to us once again when you see a former president who incited an insurrection out there conducting himself in this fashion and getting those kinds of cheers.
Well, look, that's right. Certainly there's a precedent outside the United States. Donald Trump has often operated a playbook that's familiar to anyone who has worked in a country, as Peter and I did in Russia, where its democracy was under attack, going after independent media, going after the independent judiciary or, other potential rival power centers. That's right out of not only Trump's playbook, but many others. And to your point, though, about history, Jim, I would say the thing that's so remarkable as you contemplate the Trump phenomenon, one of the reasons Peter and I want to do the book is because there's never been a president in American history, Democrats or Republicans, even in many periods of conflict, there's never been a president who sought to overturn the results of a lawful election. And so I feel like 2 years later, the fact that the Republican Party has remained tethered to Trump really puts us in uncharted territory, even by history's standards.
Right. And Peter, one thing you talk about in the book is how Trump's daughter and son-in-law, Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner, washed their hands of all of this stolen election talk before the results were even called, and that opened the door for some of the crazies to come in. The crazies appear to still be there, but tell us about what you wrote about in the book.
Well, that's exactly right. Basically, 2 days after the election, before the networks had even called it, Jared Kushner woke up in his house here in Washington and told Ivanka, hey, we're moving to Miami. And within a few weeks, they had picked out a $32 million property down in Florida. We were looking at schools for their kids. In other words, they knew the election was over. They knew it hadn't been stolen. They knew it was not going to be overturned. But rather than participate in the debate that was going on in the White House, Kushner basically said, if you're going to go with Rudy, he told the president, then I'm not going to be part of this. And that gave people like Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell and Mike Lindell and John Eastman and all these other people free rein. There was a void that they filled whispering in the president's ear, yes, you lost. Yes, you can contest this. Yes, you can overturn this, without fear of contradiction from one of his closest advisors, his own son-in-law, who instead went off to the Middle East to work on Middle East peace and maybe his future business contacts, as well as moving his family to Miami.
Yeah, I remember seeing Mike Lindell hanging outside the West Wing and thinking, you know, this guy is not here to sell pillows. And Susan, I have to ask you about this anecdote in the book where you write about then Chief of Staff John Kelly, who we all remember, one of the many chiefs of staff to go through that White House, buying quite a surprising book that he hopes will help him understand his boss. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the amazing through lines, I think, when Peter and I were able to do the reporting for this book, Jim, is to see how the testimony about Trump that's so disturbing invariably has come from Republican officials, from his own appointees. These are the people who are in the room with Donald Trump. John Kelly, retired four-star Marine general, told others that he actually purchased a book by a couple dozen mental health professionals, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, to try to understand the psychological basis of, you know, this very disruptive president he was dealing with. And he told others that it actually was helpful. And we had reporting for the book that showed that there were even other members of the cabinet who would routinely debate among themselves, is Donald Trump, in the words of one cabinet official, quote, crazy, or just acting crazy. And, you know, this is obviously, again, a way in which Trump was a real outlier among American presidents, and very, very challenging as you see him now becoming ever more dramatic in the effort to appeal or to keep his hold over his followers. Rallies like last night, you know, in some ways are even more provocative than the rallies he was holding in 2020 as he seeks to maintain his political appeal.
Yeah, and I'm just trying to figure out when I watch him at these rallies, you know, is he trying to hang on, as you said, Susan, to what he has, or is it about trying to reclaim the presidency? Perhaps it's just as simple, Peter, as he just doesn't want to let this following get away from him.
Well, I think that's right. We anticipate, of course, that he may run in 2024. But if he doesn't run in 2024, he's not going to tell us until the last possible moment, because he does crave the attention. He craves these rallies and the money that comes in through fundraising, as long as he's a possible candidate for president. And of course, with all these investigations swirling around him, there's another motive for him to run as well, which is that he thinks, or at least possibly thinks, that being a candidate might protect him in some ways, that people might be more reluctant to charge somebody who's an active candidate for president, or at the very least, he can rally these crowds by making himself out to be a martyr, a victim to the deep state and the Democrats and the media who are out to get him. So, yeah, I think that you're right, that in some ways these rallies are just as significant today as they were when he was president.
And Susan, not that we need another Jurassic Park sequel, there have been so many of them, but there's one point in the book where Trump is compared to the velociraptors in Jurassic Park that gradually learned how to open the door while they're hunting their prey, which I will confess, that is one of the more terrifying moments in that movie. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, that was a chilling moment when I was speaking with a former very senior national security official who spent a good amount of time directly in the Oval Office with Donald Trump and made the observation comparing him to the velociraptors who learned to open the door. We remember that scene with the children hiding in the kitchen, and of course they're not safe. The point was about how a Trump in a second term, Trump, had he been reelected, you know, would have been a very different and potentially even more dangerous, effective character than he was at the beginning of the presidency. People often forget that Trump, you know, was the least experienced president in some ways in modern times in terms of government. He never served a single day in government, never served a single day in the military, unlike every other president in American history. And I think, you know, clearly he didn't quite understand who he was surrounding himself at first, but over the course of the 4 years, he learned to operate the machinery of government to get what he wanted more. There are signs that he's already preparing his advisors, thinking about how to do things like fire thousands of civil servants, potentially in a second Trump term. And I think that, you know, he would pursue many of those agenda items that he didn't manage to get done in a first term. Things like not just building the wall, but potentially withdrawing from NATO. John Bolton and others have said that that would have been top of his second term agenda. He talked to us about his willingness to hold up South Korea for billions of dollars more, or else to withdraw U.S. troops from South Korea. That was in
Wow.
our interview in Mar-a-Lago. So,
Yeah, he seems to think that he can conduct this kind of foreign policy. If he gets back into the White House, and it is remarkable to think about it. I've talked to advisors who have said to me, if he gets back in there, it's going to be Trumpism on steroids. I guess as Samuel L. Jackson said in Jurassic Park, hold on to your butts. But all right, Peter Baker and Susan Glasser, thanks so much. Really great talking to both of you. Appreciate it very much. Again, their book is called The Divider, Trump in the White House, 2017 to 2021. Be sure to check it out. Many thanks to Peter and Susan for joining us.